Welcome to Be Well. I'm Jonathan from Your Why, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to have these conversations with leaders in their field related to living a mindful, vibrant, fulfilling life. I'm very interested in our conversation today. It's been top of mind in many sectors of the world and in our communities today, just because of a higher incidence of mental health challenges due to the pandemic. So we're going to talk about a lot of things so that we can recognize and help prevent issues related to suicidality. I'm honored to have Shawnette Smith, a licensed marriage family therapist, with us today from Sharp Mesa Vista. She specializes in issues of suicidality, mental health, and suicide prevention initiatives. So I'm just, we're going to have a very informative opportunity for us to learn about this area. Also, I encourage you to use the chat to let us know what questions you may have, what comments you may have. Shawnette has a number of resources that she's going to offer us as well that we'll put into the chat, and also mail out some attachments to each of you after if you're interested. One of the things I think of, Be Well is meant to have us have the opportunity to tap into mindfulness. And I think of mindfulness as that resource that allows us to ground ourselves using our breath. And with that, we're able to move into this moment and have awareness and move into a place of stillness. And I recognize that with mindfulness, we have the ability to know that all experiences will pass. All feelings will pass. All thoughts will pass like clouds in a sky. And so as I think of a serious topic of suicidality, and when someone is challenged with being in that particular space, having the resource of mindfulness can be something that allows for a grounding to move out of maybe their head, out of those feelings, or at least the recognition that with time, some of that will pass. But with that kind of preface, Shawnette, wonderful to have you with us today. So tell us a little bit about your background and how it applies to our topic today.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So my name is Shawnette Smith. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I have been in the field of social services for roughly 20 years, maybe just under 20 years. I am the senior specialist for Sharp Mesa Vista. I have experience working inpatient psychiatric with our psychiatric evaluation team, going out to emergency rooms, doing crisis interventions, assessing for the need of hospitalization or lack of need, and other services. I also have worked outpatient with our intensive outpatient programming, and then into administration. I've done lots of talks around the county, as well as every year for the last almost 4 years now, I guess this is the 4th year, have been really instrumental in our Suicide Prevention Awareness Month activities, hosting talks, whether I'm doing the talk or getting a colleague to do the talk, and then just really trying to be a champion for mental health, breaking the stigma, really learning about mental health and the challenges that one faces within that, as well as family members.
Shawnette, thank you for this important work that you're doing. I alluded to just how the pandemic has impacted one's mental health. If I can have you start there and share how that may have increased or affected the incidence of suicide today.
Yeah, if I could actually just pivot and go back for a moment, I want us to do a little bit of a grounding exercise, because what we are talking about is a really serious matter. And like you said, mindfulness really gets us in the here and now and can relax us. So I'm going to ask that we take a deep breath in through our nose and exhale through our mouth. We're going to use our 5 senses. So what are 5 things that you see around you? Especially now we're all remote, or maybe back in our offices, or I don't know, some of us might be working from a park. So what are 5 things that you see around you that you could recognize? Take another deep breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. Using touch, what are 4 things that you can touch around you? Your keyboard, your cell phone, cup of water or tea, noticing the textures. Take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Name 3 things that you hear, and obviously naming those to yourself. The sound of my voice, a bird chirping if you're outside, a fan blowing if you're inside, the air conditioning. Take a deep breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. Name 2 things that you can smell. A mint, cookies baking in the background, short ribs that you have in the crock pot. I don't know. Take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Name 2 things. No, I said 2 things that you can smell. Sorry. Name 1 thing that you can taste. Maybe the water that you just had, coffee. Breathe in through your nose. Notice those things. Out through your mouth. Settle into where you are. Take stock of where you are. We are in this moment together. Okay. So Jonathan, you asked me.
Thank you for doing that. And I also went back to that smell because I smelled those short ribs and I wanted to stay there for a little bit. So you allowed me to go back just for a moment. But thank you. That was a beautiful exercise. So thanks for the experience.
Thank you.
So the pandemic and mental health.
Yeah. So, it's very interesting. This pandemic has really created a moment for lots of us and lots of emotions. The CDC had recently in 2020 done a little study, and it looks like 31%, according to their study, of individuals across the US reported an increase or uptick in symptoms of depression and anxiety. 26% of US adults reported trauma or stressors related to some disorder. And then 13% started using a substance, alcohol, marijuana, other substances. And then 11% of US adults seriously considered the option of suicide. 40% of US adults reported struggling with mental health and substance use. From, people staying home with our children, we all love kids, right? Maybe your nieces or nephews or grandchildren or actual children or, young adults, young people that you are parenting. We are now faced with having to stay home and act as employer, individual, teacher, counselor. These things create an atmosphere of overwhelm and anxiety. Then you couple that with guilt, right? That maybe I shouldn't be feeling this way. Parents say this to themselves all the time. It's especially true for moms, right? I shouldn't feel this way. And so now you have guilt about feeling overwhelmed, and we have increased anxiety, increased depression, and then we just get to a point where we feel like maybe we can't do it anymore. So the pandemic has really created this, again, this space of overwhelm and angst. It has equally created a space for people to actively talk about mental health and what they're feeling, something that we've not necessarily seen across our country, across the world before. Many cultures simply don't talk about mental health issues, right? Sometimes we look at people as weak or less than, unable to hack it if they are struggling at any moment. How many times do we ourselves look at someone and go, wow, they're so strong, without the consideration of strong people suffer, strong people break down because it's like a pencil under weight, right? You can only take so much stress before we snap. And the pandemic is that stressor that has caused us to kind of break under the pressure of life and living, and isolation is the most important, right? There's a thing about, people saying like, oh, I really like to be alone. But then when you are forced to be alone, that creates a whole other set of issues and confliction So, you know, I think stress, isolation,
So
loneliness.
Jeanette, you've led us down this path where it is pretty profound. First off, the statistics that you provided shows how significant the challenge has been that has really just increased due to the conditions of the pandemic. And then you talked about those conditions of isolation, the roles that we've had to assume with limited resources. You can see how the incidence of mental health challenges has greatly increased. So if you could take me now down how one leads into this suicide ideation and what causes, you talked about these conditions, but how does one get to that other place?
Yeah, I mean, how many ways, right? There are countless ways from, again, isolation, right? When we are left to our own devices, there's a saying in therapy that, kind of don't go in there being your head alone. And when you are faced with being at home alone in the middle of a pandemic, you have almost no choice but to be there with yourself alone, thinking about life, rehearsing the shoulda, coulda, wouldas in life, and maybe increased physical symptoms, right? As we are grapple with our mortality, people can start to go down this slippery slope of thinking, I can't do this anymore. I don't know how I'm going to manage. I don't want to be here anymore. And that thought is kind of ground zero of your trail to suicidal ideation. And it really can happen to any of us, right? That, I mean, I've certainly had feelings like, where do I go from here? Like, how do I manage? How do I maneuver, right? And if I stayed in that could have been a slippery slope to thinking more about it, right? So as we see people struggle with medical issues, as we see people struggle with depression, anxiety, other mental health disorders, as we see people struggle with the general woes of life, financial woes, parenting, relationships, lack thereof, right? Medical issues. These are all things that can lead to one having suicidal thoughts. And then you couple it with some sort of substance use, it just gets us there a little bit faster.
So what I was hearing you say, Shanette, is that there's these different life conditions that we're presented with, but then it is that self-talk, those thoughts that we say to ourselves. And what I was hearing is it's almost as if they get momentum. They kind of build upon each other and they snowball, and then they get traction, and then they increase. And so pretty quickly you're narrowing your vision, so to speak. And then you get to that place, as you were saying, where, I don't want to feel like this anymore. I don't want to think like this anymore.
Absolutely. And it varies for each person, right? There's not like a 0 to 60 or 0 to 100. It is a progression that can be fast or slow depending on the person and that individual's set of circumstances. If someone has been battling with anxiety or depression for quite some time, and then you layer in the pandemic or other life stressors, we can get there pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And then for some who have quote unquote never struggled before, and this is like their first time, and they are left to their own devices and not able to talk to someone, we could potentially get there pretty quickly.
So Shanette, I know as a clinician, you know how to recognize kind of signs, symptoms of someone that might be going down that path. But for the layperson, around family and friends, and even for ourselves, what are signs that we should be looking for? How do we identify that?
So let's start with like the critical signs, right? So if someone starts talking about wanting to end their life, having a plan, researching that plan, and then verbalizing reasons not to live, those are kind of the critical warning signs of an imminent suicidal crisis. But then there are things that can be more subtle. Changes in behavior, changes in sleep pattern, increased alcohol use, which is not maybe as subtle, but can be, right? People can hide their use. People verbalizing that there's just no reason for them to be here anymore. Any sudden changes in mood, withdrawing. We all know someone who's kind of that quiet person, so to speak, and really self-kept. But then when that person is no longer, you may notice that they're no longer answering text messages or even getting together that once in a while, we need to recognize that and notice that. If people start to talk about like being a burden to other people, to the world, we want to notice that increased anxiety or agitation. We want to really notice that. People start giving away possessions, not having a need for things anymore, or quote unquote putting things in order. Those are all signs that something is really happening.
So what do we do? So if we start to see something like that, to recognize certain patterns that you spoke to, those are excellent ways to identify. What do we do? How do we respond to that? And I think you shared with me there was it might have been through the National Suicide Prevention. I think Be the One Too. And we're talking about how do we take action. And so, if you will.
Yeah, so for the young people, it's going to be the hashtag, or for, the older people, we're going to call that a pound sign. Either way, hashtag or pound, be the one, number 1, 2, TO. And really it's a campaign about 5 steps, 5 ways that you can help someone suffering, not just from a mental health crisis or, not just from a suicidal crisis, but from a mental health crisis. So be the one to really first and foremost wants you to ask. And by asking, they're really asking you to listen, right? Ask the question, but then the most important part of that is being willing to listen with a non-judgmental ear and stance to what the person is telling you, right? Listen to them, hear what they're saying to you. Don't assume you know anything. Ask clarifying questions. And then be there, right, is the next step. So first we're going to ask. Secondly, we're going to be there. This is really a continuation of that non-judgmental stance, that you are not going to say, I totally understand what you're saying, because you might not, right? A lot of times we can empathize with someone, but we don't have a true understanding of what that person is going through in their individual set of circumstances. So you're going to be there. You're going to find ways to connect with that person, essentially, right? And really, this is where I think mindfulness comes into play, because your version of connectedness isn't necessarily someone else's version of connectedness, right? So we want to really be aware of that. And what is that person's love language almost, right? How do they feel connected to other people, not about how you feel? So notice that and be there for them in that way. Next, we're going to be the one to keep them safe. So that can feel a little overwhelming, I want to recognize, because it's like, how do I keep someone safe from
a big responsibility in that moment.
Yeah. It's not about like having all of the answers. It's about knowing how to help someone get the help that they need. Right. So offering supportive resources, creating some, what I like to call emotional space between the thought of suicide and the actual plan of suicide. And this is where a lot of people would talk about means restriction. I don't want to miss that very important part. So if someone's talking about suicide and they verbalize a plan of how they might want to end their lives, medication, a firearm, those are big ones. We want to really talk about, do you have a stockpile of medication, right? Is there a way maybe Do they take medications on a routine basis? Could you help devise a plan to have someone else or yourself hold that medication and kind of divvy it out and make sure that that person is taking it? That, what I just described, can be a really big undertaking. And I want to encourage people that you don't have to be the one to take that on, and you can be the one to help devise a plan and seek other resources and support systems within that person's support system.
So
Okay.
being the one, what I was hearing is that you want to, and somehow assess the feasibility, how actionable, how readily actionable that plan is. And that may give you a clue in terms of how serious or what kind of state they are in. And again, you also, as we started, each person's 0 to 60 is individualized and different, so you never really know. But some of that, what you're talking about, is assessing how feasible that plan is.
Yeah,
Great.
absolutely. And then the last two ways to help someone is connect them, right? Connect them to a lifeline, a crisis line, connect them to a therapist, a psychiatrist, a medical professional in general, the emergency room. San Diego has an excellent PERT team, which stands for Psychiatric Emergency Response. We'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this, but really connecting people to a service that can be of support to them outside of you. Because while you are a great support, you are not 24/7. Right? I used to kind of tease and say, I'm a social worker at the heart of who I am, the core, but I can't shrink myself down and put myself in anybody's pocket, but I can give you a plethora of resources that are really accessible.
Wonderful.
Last but not least, we want to follow up, because there's nothing like spilling out our emotions, our feelings, our, innermost thoughts, for them to just kind of drop off. So if someone shares this information with you on any level, I'm going to encourage you to round back with that person, really follow up with them and check in on them, right? So that you don't drop the ball and contribute to them feeling worse.
You shared, and it's pretty obvious that this is weighty. The gravity of this is very intense. It's life and death at times. And so I also think of that caregiver, that one, they may need support and resource. I mean, if they're holding that space that's pretty intense, it may be hard for them to circle back and check in, just because what do I do with all that? And so I could see the need for that person to get some support as well.
Yeah, and I think that's about really taking stock of yourself in any given moment on any given day. What we are able to hold or give, contribute today may be very different from what we are able to hold and give and contribute tomorrow, or even later this evening when we get home and deal with our families, right?
Yes.
And so really managing yourself. My kids, when they were in grade school, went to an after-school program, and there was a program that was ICMM, which is I can manage myself. And I always think about that in a very mindful way of, am I managing myself today? Am I managing my needs, and as well as the needs of the people who depend on me or that I want to give time and energy to? But if I'm not managing my needs, I can't possibly help or aid in managing other people's needs. So being really mindful of that.
I think about as you get on the airplane, it's the oxygen, put it on yourself first before you're able to help somebody else. So we have to take care of ourselves before we have something to offer to another. Shawnette, you actually sensitized me to languaging around the discussion of suicide. So if you'll bring through points that would be important for us to just be aware of.
Yeah, it's a great question. And our language evolves over time, right? And there was once upon a time when we said that people commit suicide or they committed suicide. When you think about commit and then the word that follows, it has a very negative connotation, right? Truly, blatantly criminal connotation, right? That somebody commits a crime, somebody commits a heinous act. So when we put commit in front of suicide and report that someone has committed suicide, we are really stigmatizing a mental health condition, right? We are saying that they did something wrong, they did something bad, they did something unforgivable. And while people are going to feel an array of feelings when they lose someone to suicide, that person did not commit a crime, right? So they died by suicide, or they lost their life to suicide, right? Is the phrase that we want to use, because they did lose their life to an illness, right? That their death was a result of overwhelm, right? So we really want to replace the word commit with die or died, death or loss.
That's excellent. Very, very helpful.
There's two more that I kind of want to talk about if I can. When we talk about someone having suicidal thoughts, we often still refer to them as suicidal, that they are suicidal, which can put a cloak or a coat over them as if that is all that they are, right? You often hear also someone say they're bipolar, they're depressed. Well, they aren't any of those things. They are experiencing all of those things, or they are challenged with all of those things, right? So someone is not suicidal, but they may be having suicidal thoughts. They may be experiencing suicidal thoughts. They are not the sum of that thought, no more than they are the sum of an illness. So really being mindful of that, to not encapsulate someone in their mental health disorder or their thought pattern. Last but not least, just when we talk about suicide, and the media does this sometimes, where they were successful in their suicide attempt. We're kind of glamorizing the action. We want to say that someone survived a suicide attempt or lived through a suicide attempt, that they were neither successful or unsuccessful, because success or lack thereof is really about effort and action, right? And this suicide attempts are not an effort, right? It's not something that someone's trying to accomplish. They are struggling and they're experiencing suicidal thoughts, which creates sometimes an action towards suicide.
That's very helpful. Much more mindful, aware versus, as you said, just kind of concretizing that a person is this. Very, very helpful. Shawnette, I know we have just a moment left, so I'll offer you the opportunity. Anything in closing? I know you wanted to reference something about PERT as well, so that we're aware, but I'll let you decide how you want to use the last couple moments.
Yeah, okay, so I'll brevity is key here. So we want to really personalize the idea of suicide, really understanding that this could be any one of us. It could be someone that we love, that we care about. And so to not really have it be so externalized that it's the theys and the thems of the world, but it's really the us and the I of the world. Because we could all get there at any moment, right? So really just understanding the thought process behind a suicidal crisis, a mental health crisis, and not saying that you yourself will ever be there. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. We hope for the best that you won't. And it is a possibility given the nature of life and its unpredictable patterns. But then if you do, so like, we we talked about you're all going to receive an email that has some resources. So NAMI has a great resource, and NAMI is the National Alliance for Mental Illness. There are going to be 2 PDFs that we've included in there about really navigating a mental health crisis, to include suicidal crisis, and knowing the warning signs. There's a great link to knowing the signs of a suicidal crisis for older adults, for young adults, for children in general. And then most important, I think, is the suicide prevention lifeline. We will want you to know that. That is 1-800-273-TALK, 1-800-273-TALK. San Diego, if you're a San Diego County resident, there is the Access and Crisis line. I have just forgotten that number all of a sudden. So give me one moment and I'm grabbing it here. So you can call the San Diego Access and Crisis line at 888-724-7240. That will also be on the information email that you receive. Yeah.
Wow. Shawnette, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your insights. So raised our awareness and our resource to be able to meet when we might find ourselves, or those that we love, or those that we encounter in this type of a space. So really appreciate the work you're doing and what you offered us today. So thank you very much. And we will send out those resources to those that are on this call. And again, everyone, thank you for being here. And until we meet again, please be well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.